Trish Thacker here. Really happy to be joining the patiently waiting group here as we continue to work through our series. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started with our content for today. All right, here it comes. So today we're going to be talking about shame. I would invite you to grab some paper or a notebook or a keyboard. If you're someone who takes notes in whatever fashion that you take them, have something handy. It's been my experience in working with people around issues of shame that the ahas and the realizations can come fairly quickly, but then they also seem to kind of go away pretty quickly, almost like a door shuts. So sometimes it can be really nice to capture them on paper as you're going, or in a computer. It doesn't have to be paper, of course. So before we get started, I'm just going to walk you through a quick check-in exercise. As I said, today we will be talking about shame. And this can feel pretty personal and can be challenging for some people. So I'm going to invite you to check in with yourself. So if you're comfortable doing it, I'd invite you to close your eyes and take a few deep breaths in and out. Just kind of get grounded and centered. And then ask yourself, how are you feeling? Do you feel ready to listen and to learn and to contemplate some of this new information? And if you don't feel ready, what do you think that you need to do in order to feel more ready? Is there a task that's kind of lurking in the back of your mind? Do you need to send a text, close the door? Anything that you can do to increase your ability to be present during our time together will be helpful. So I would invite you to do that and then come back and join us when you're ready. So just a review of our sessions so far. We've talked about attachment, which is the process of internalizing the primary attachment strategy of our primary caregiver. We've talked about trauma in terms of what happens with the brain and body in the presence of traumatic events. And we've talked about temperament. That is how we tend to think, decide, understand, rejuvenate, and plan. These processes all shape and color the lenses through which we view and interact with the world. And shame is another powerful process that influences how we understand and interact with people and with our environment. Brene Brown is an internationally known scholar on issues of shame resilience, and living wholeheartedly. And she's done 20 years of research. I encourage you to get any one of her books. They're all fantastic. But one of the things that she has noted over these 20 years of research with people is that love and belonging are irreducible human needs. And in the absence of them, there is always suffering. Therefore, if shame causes us to believe that we are flawed and unworthy of love and belonging, shame drives suffering. So that's one of the reasons that we want to talk about it. Shame causes us to feel separate and isolated. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment as we walk through some definitions. So defining shame. Dr. Henry Cloud, a psychologist who's been in practice for probably 30 years, he describes shame as experiencing our badness outside of relationships. Brene Brown defines shame as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. June Tangney defines shame as an intense negative emotion characterized by the perception of a global devaluation of the self. Shame involves a painful scrutiny of the entire self, a feeling that I am an unworthy, incompetent, or bad person. So with those ideas of what is shame, how does it show up, let's talk a little bit about this experience of shame and how it works in our brains and in our bodies. So the subjective experience of shame is an initial shock and flooding with painful emotion. Shame is a relatively wordless state in which speech and thought are inhibited. It's also an acutely self-conscious state. The person feels small, ridiculous, and exposed, humiliated sometimes. There's a wish to hide, characteristically expressed by covering the face with the hands. The person wishes to sink into the floor or crawl into a hole and die, things like that. Shame is always implicitly a relational experience. And this is the discussion around the experience of shame by Judy Herman, who has been researching shame for years and years. Janina Fisher is a PhD psychologist she's in private practice, but she's also an active researcher. She's speaks internationally on issues of trauma, on psychomotor therapy, sensory motor therapy, things like that. She's really well respected and has been working in the field of trauma, dissociation, and shame for 30 or 40 years. Anything that you can get that she writes is going to be incredibly informative and helpful. So she talks about shame as it is embodied in the individual. It's a visceral physical experience. So I think one of the reasons why I'm kind of starting kind of in this intellectual and then I'm kind of moving down into the experience of it is that we have the ability to talk about shame on the surface. We can, in fact, we can even kind of bandy it about in conversation, tell people don't shame me, that kind of thing. It's become much more common to use shame in everyday conversation. It didn't used to be. It's a very uncommon subject matter, but it's becoming more mainstream as the work of social scientists and psychological scientists and interpersonal neurobiology are fleshing out how this works its way out in our lives. But in order to really to more deeply understand it and then to be able to intervene and shift to rewire for shame resilience, I want us to start talking about it as an embodied process. And what that means is that there are absolute physical characteristics that we experience when we experience shame. So as I said, Dr. Fisher talks about shame as as being embodied in the individual. It's visceral. It's a physical experience. Visceral meaning like that gut level experience that it's hard to get words around, but that we know is present. She states that shame is driven by the body and reinforced by meaning making. So again, we often talk about, oh, well, I feel shame because of this. I feel shame because of that. I feel shame because I was traumatized, those kinds of things. But these are really intellectual constructs. What happens when we are experiencing it? Brene Brown calls it a shame storm, I think, or a shame spiral, something like that. Is that we aren't thinking about it intellectually anymore. We are experiencing it. It's driven by the body and reinforced by meaning making. So I have this physical experience in response to something. It's been triggered. And then I am going to decide what that means. I might have this gut feeling of being really uncomfortable or scared or just feeling off balance, or I might be nauseous, those kinds of things. And then I will attach meaning to that. So I will decide what it means. So let's say I'm having a conversation with someone and I have this shame experience. So I have that visceral feeling in my body. I might determine or I might make the meaning that I feel uncomfortable because I'll never be good with people. Anything else that you could insert in there. I'm uncomfortable because I'm anxious. I'm uncomfortable because I've never learned how to talk to people. I'm an introvert, and I'll never have the ease with people that other people have. So I'll attach meaning to it, and that actually re-triggers and intensifies the shame. The meaning we assign to events and thoughts and reactions that we're having in our body reactivates our body again and intensifies the shame. So let's say I'm talking with somebody and I'm feeling uncomfortable. Maybe it's a boss. Maybe I'm talking to somebody who's in a position of authority, and I'm feeling uncomfortable. I might make the meaning that I'll never be able to talk well with people in authority. which will then intensify my physical experience, which will then intensify my feeling of shame. And then it's going to reactivate my body, and it's going to start that cycle. It's going to keep things moving so that I'm going to make the meaning, which is going to make my reaction worse, which is going to intensify and improve my meaning making, and just keep it rolling. So it intensifies the shame. And then shame is also, we've learned, and she has learned through years of research, it's a survival response, like fight, flight, and freeze. We talk about that a lot in terms of trauma. But one of the things that that we're only really learning now that also falls in that category with the fight, flight, and freeze is the option or the response to submit. So shame is survival, just like fight, flight, and freeze. And the shame response occurs or can be triggered and activated when submission is the only option. So we might fight, we might flee, we might freeze, and we might submit. That might be how we survived early relationships, early trauma, early abuse, early difficulties. Submission might have been our only option, and that carries shame with it as well. And shame is a signal of interpersonal danger. So we have this activated response because historically, when we have experienced that feeling, it's been because something bad is going to happen. Bad is going to happen. So that's what we think. Our procedural memory tells us, when I have this feeling, then we get in a fight. When I have this feeling, then I don't know what to say, that kind of a thing. So shame developed and was developed early in our lives as a signal of interpersonal danger, and it functions to try to protect us. That was the origination of it. And because shame is a sign of danger, it triggers our survival responses, like I was saying. So here's again where some of the research is, it's so interesting, and it sheds so much light on the different experiences of shame and how they show up in our lives. So as I said, since shame is a sign of danger, our body is telling us that there's some danger that's coming, and that's why our body reacts. It'll trigger that fight, flight, or freeze or submit response in our body. So fight and flight are driven by the sympathetic nervous system. So we have in our autonomic nervous systems, those are the ones that we don't have to make work. They just work all the time. We don't have to tell our body to breathe or digest food. We don't tell our body to secrete hormones, or we don't tell our pupils to adjust in the dark, those kinds of things. That's all controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And that nervous system has two branches, essentially. So one branch is the sympathetic nervous system. And it can help to distinguish between the two, to realize that sympathetic means that it happens in response to something. So our sympathetic nervous system will react and will become engaged under a situation of threat. And it will cause what's called hyperarousal. It'll drive us toward action. That's where the fight and flight are powered. They're driven by the sympathetic nervous system. They will cause us to act quickly and decisively. And so that's the part of the system that has been engaged when the shame comes up, or historically, that was the part of our autonomic nervous system that was engaged through the shame experience and then got wired in. So what happens is that idea of that principle of hyperarousal. That means that our body is releasing cortisol and adrenaline. It's coursing through our veins. It's giving us that extra power, that extra ability to fight or flee. And it drives toward action. For someone who's been experiencing shame for a significant period of time, so maybe someone who has developed shame as a child and is experiencing it into adulthood, this gets wired in and it becomes part of how we interact with the world. Again, shame is one of those influences that helps shape the color and intensity of the lenses through which we view the world. So, over a long period of time, if my sympathetic nervous system is getting driven regularly because of my shame experience, what you might see, what it might look like, is a lot of fixing behaviors and overwork or just nervousness, hypervigilance. I might be really jumpy. I might have difficulty with sleep. I might have a hard time relaxing. But all those things that would come along with a drive by something that's driven by the sympathetic nervous system. So shame can trigger that part, can trigger the sympathetic nervous system. It can also trigger the parasympathetic nervous system. So, and this is where the freeze and submit responses come from. So the freeze and submit responses are driven by the parasympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system moves toward conservation of energy and resources. So your parasympathetic nervous system is kicking in when, if someone, let's say you experience a traumatic fall and you have a compound fracture of your leg, your parasympathetic nervous system is the part that might cause you to fall asleep or pass out because it's conserving resources, it's conserving energy in order to be able to help you survive the event and whatever it is that happened. So when the parasympathetic nervous system is driving, again, it moves toward conservation of energy. So this manifests as hypoarousal. So that hyperarousal is kind of being driven by an engine. The hypoarousal is that loss of energy, that drained feeling, the loss of energy and drive. It can lead to feeling numb. It can lead to the emotional experience of shame, disgust, despair, and all of these experiences of all of our energy draining out of us, of losing all of our drive, the emotional numbing. That all triggers a submit response when our body kind of closes in and bends over, in a sense, like bends down. When you think like submission, you can think of maybe someone who, if someone is coming toward you and they're attacking you, and a submit might be doing something like this. Um, so it's that position of acknowledging the power of the other. That's that submit response. Um, and it fuels the belief that I'm helpless, hopeless, and worthless. So this can be really difficult. We can also flip back and forth between kind of fight, flight, and then the freeze, submit, which is really uncomfortable. So a person might have a period of time where they're really activated and kind of hyper aroused and nervous and have all this energy, and they're moving quickly to try to solve, resolve, protect themselves, that kind of thing. And then it's almost like they burn out or they hit a wall, and then they hit that conservation of energy where it's like, why would I try? This is hopeless. I've done this all before. I've been through this. And again, that's triggered by that parasympathetic nervous system. So trauma, shame can trigger either or both. And one of the most difficult things I think to work with is those folks who have that experience where the shame is being driven by that freeze and submit, by the parasympathetic nervous system, because it feels like it doesn't make sense. I hate being depressed. I hate feeling anxious, but there's the literal energy that it takes to seek help or to improve or to, do the things that like we know will help us feel better. It literally feels like there is not energy available to do them. So that again is part of what leads to that sense of helplessness, hopelessness, worthlessness. In conflict situations, there are two basic choices. So we can either choose to escalate or de-escalate. And the conflict doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be a fight. It doesn't have to be a battle. It doesn't have to be a war. The conflict can be as we experience it in our interpersonal relationships. But when conflict arises, when there's the conflicting ideas of what's right and wrong and who does what and those kinds of things, we really do have those two basic choices. We're going to either escalate the conflict or de-escalate it. And what shame does is it serves as an inhibitory function. So in what it does is it then causes, as a defensive strategy, it triggers us to submit. So it inhibits the that fight and flight. It inhibits the assertiveness. It inhibits our sense of you're wrong. Is one of the ways I to try to keep us safe. So kind of continuing along this thought, this is the work of Gilbert and Andrews. Shame signals. So, and those are the signals that we see that someone is experiencing shame. So the signals are head down, the gaze is avoidant. Um, you know, just a minute while this resolves. There we go. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what's happening. There's a little freeze in the screen there. But so these shame signals are designed to de-escalate or help us to escape from these interpersonal conflicts. So insofar as shame is related to submissiveness and to appeasement behavior, like to de-escalating, like let's do, hey, can't we all just get along? Um, it is a damage limitation strategy. So here's this interpersonal conflict. I perceive the interpersonal conflict. And shame for me, if that has been wired into me, might trigger then my submission response so that things don't, let nothing bad happen, kind of a thing. It doesn't matter what's right or wrong. It matters that you calm down or that the situation calms down or that the threat goes away. And that this damage limitation strategy, it is part of what has served to help us. It has protected us. And these shame signals are really powerful. The head down, the avoidant gaze, that kind of a thing, maybe kind of hunched over. I just want to give you an example because we've been meeting together like this for a while. I've, done a lot of work over the course of my adult life on shame and attachment and all those things that we're talking about. And recently, actually a couple of years ago, I had a really significant back injury and I could not stand up straight. It literally hunched me over like this. I'm actually still recovering from it. My back doesn't straighten out entirely yet. Hopefully soon. I continue to work on it. But what I realized looking back is that as I lost that ability to stand up straight, as I was hunched over like this, like all the old shame messages came back, and I realized that it was impacting my ability to show up as a leader, to show up at work, to show up in interpersonal relationships, because this hunched over physical attitude was triggering these old body memories of shame that I had from long ago. And the point at which I realized it was just so incredibly freeing. Um, because there's that helplessness, that hopelessness that it triggers, um, it can feel like, well, I don't understand. It's got this wordless quality to it, but all I knew is that things weren't going the way that I wanted them to. And when I realized and was able to, also able to, just because of physical therapy, stand up in a straighter manner, I've been able then to mitigate that, to deal with it, to address those body memories of old shame. So that even if I do end up kind of hunched over, as might happen at the end of a really long day, or if I'm having a really bad day with my back, I don't have to live from a stance of shame, even though it might look like it. So these shame signals that our body has wired into us, or that we might see in other people, are really powerful. Those body memories, that encoding that happened early on, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a while, in a few minutes, about how that happens. those physical shame signals are really powerful. So pay attention to those. If you're someone who struggles with making eye contact, um, sure, there could be a social anxiety component for sure. But it would also be really helpful to look at, is there a shame component? And if you've been experiencing social anxiety for any period of time, there is likely a shame component because having the experience of social anxiety is it's demoralizing and it feels bigger than we are, and it causes us to often feel kind of helpless and hopeless. So examining the shame aspects or the shame potential in something that we're going through can be really important as well. So we're talking, we've talked about what is shame, what is the experience of shame. It's shame is this basically this sense of being worthless, of not being worthy of love and belonging. It's that suffering. And that happens in an embodied process that we carry in our bodies. It's visceral. So we have the meaning that we've attached to it, but we also have those physical experiences of it. So what causes this? What causes shame? Trauma can cause shame. There's a large body of research that correlates unresolved or partially resolved or chronic trauma with the development experience of shame. Um, it's a it's actually kind of fairly common knowledge for people to understand that if they have trauma, they have likely experienced, if the trauma has not been resolved, they've likely experienced some form of shame. And this can be particularly acute for those whose response to the trauma was that freeze or submit response, that parasympathetic dampening down, that submission, that de-escalation. Because it is that loss of energy that carries with it that hopeless feeling, helpless feeling, that can be a very strong driver of a shame system or a shame complex, some people call it. A complex meaning that it is a system of shame that's been encoded in our bodies, not like a large organization or something like that. And understanding that trauma can cause shame. This is also particularly acute when the trauma was relational. When trauma occurs from something that an accident, a storm blows a tree limb down on your house and breaks through your window and knocks you unconscious or something. Obviously, that would, for many people, they would experience it as a traumatic event, but that wasn't a relational trauma. It wasn't a relational harm. But when trauma is relational, when trauma happens, when there's abuse, neglect, if there's relational manipulation or leveraging, those kinds of things, it is much more likely that we will experience shame in that context. So in talking about the development of shame in the presence of trauma, so let's say that someone has a history of neglect. In the case of neglect, the unspoken message that is internalized by the child, if we've experienced childhood neglect, is that there must be something wrong with me because I'm not worthy to be noticed, loved, or cared for. If only I were a better person or a better child, or I didn't have any needs at all, I wouldn't be such a burden on them, and then they would love me and want to be around me. That's kind of the nature of what gets internalized in cases of early neglect or childhood neglect. In the cases of abuse, physical, sexual, emotional, or psychological abuse, the unspoken message that we internalize is that there must be something so wrong with me that I deserve to be hurt. If I were only a better person, they would love me and they wouldn't do this to me. So basically, like, I earned it. This is what I deserve. So as those messages get internalized, if there's early trauma, chronic trauma, trauma from the family of origin, those are the kind of messages that get internalized, and they are shame-based messages. So what else can cause shame? Now, this is one of the reasons why I think, one of the many reasons why I think it's so important to talk about in this context, as we've been covering attachment and trauma and temperament, and now we're looking at shame, because internalized insecure attachments insecure attachment strategies can drive shame. So if you remember all the way back to when we were talking about what is the process of attachment and internalizing the primary attachment strategy of our primary caregiver, we attune with that primary caregiver. We internalize their primary attachment strategy, and then that influences how we view the world and people. So in a secure attachment relationship, I internalize that, these are the mirror neurons. I internalize the internal state of my mom. And she has a secure attachment. So she helps me contain my emotions. She helps me learn how to deal with them. I view the world as generally good, and then I'm generally okay. And so that just continues, and that's how we interact with the world. If there's anxious attachment, again, so I'm going to internalize, I'm going to attune with my parent, internalize it, that anxious attachment strategy, the containment of my emotions and the teaching me of how to handle them is going to be intrusive and or inconsistent. And so what I'm going to learn is that that the world is unpredictable and I'm scared. For dismissive attachment, going through that is that that internalized state, that the world is cold and uncaring and I'm alone. And I'm kind of okay with that, which is what gets internalized over time. And then that continues to influence how we interact with people in relationships. And then and the environment. And then there's the disorganized attachment that comes, the traumatic attachment. And so that happens when the caregiving relationship has been traumatic in and of itself, when the caregiver is a source of pain, when they are supposed to be a source of comfort. It sets up that impossible dilemma that can't be resolved, that drive toward the caregiver because they're safety and they're who takes care of me, and the drive away because they cause pain. And so what gets internalized from that then is that the world is unpredictable and scary, and I'm alone and scared in it, and I don't know what to do, kind of a thing. Is that disorganized? It's called disorganized attachment strategy. So any of the insecure attachment strategies, so that would be the anxious, the dismissive, or the traumatic or disorganized, can cause us to develop a shame system within us that literally becomes hardwired in how we interact with people in the world. So parent-child misattunement. So again, we're trying to attune with our parents in order to internalize their attachment strategies. That's how we internalize love. That's how we know that we have value and worth. So misattunement explains why so many children and adults identify with struggling with shame, even though they might not have had an experience of neglect or abuse or trauma. That's why so many of us are struggling with this. Statistically, depending on which study you look at, 50% or less of people in the United States have a secure attachment strategy. So if we think about that kind of the growing base of shame that we have in our culture, this is something that's going to be really important for us to come to terms with as individuals, in relationships with our families, at work, friendships, all those things, because we are becoming a shame-based culture. So again, despite the many advantages that we have in our society, where we have great medical care, we have access to all this information, all those kinds of things. That also then can contribute to parents who are really busy and really stressed. Maybe they engage with media and technology more than they engage with their kids. And so that can develop into misattunement. Now, I'm not trying to lay guilt on anybody at all, but what I'm talking about is that, back in the 70s and 60s, when attachment research was being conducted, it was a larger percentage of people that had secure attachment, and that number is continuing to go down over time. So we are going to see kind of a burgeoning community or a population of people who are struggling with shame because of these misattuned parent-child relationships. And so as relates to these internalized insecure attachment strategies that we maybe have again internalized from those primary relationships, Shame is the core, really, of all insecure attachments and attachment disorders, for that matter. Um, each insecure attachment style has their unique qualities, but shame is the quality that is present within all of the insecure attachment strategies. Shame shows up in insecure attachments as the feeling and the belief that I am defective, that I'm inherently not lovable. It's important to remember that not only is this a belief system, but this becomes wired into our nervous system. So we have that visceral sense of knowing. We just believe it's true. We're not necessarily recalling specific situations and then adding the meaning that we're not lovable. We have the visceral response, that feeling, and we have already kind of done some of that meaning making, and it gets ingrained, it gets internalized. We get these neural networks that develop that support this over time. So not only is it a belief pattern, but it has also become wired into our nervous system, so that it's this gut feeling. It's a whole body response to a situation when that shame has been triggered and we're feeling unlovable. So as you know, again, kind of going back to that whole development of relationship and attachment, and of course we can do work. We can resolve our attachment issues. Nobody is stuck. This doesn't mean that we're stuck in shame for the rest of our lives. Absolutely not. Um, But just talking then about that process of the internal wiring that comes from the insecure attachment strategies. As a child continues their social, emotional, and psychological development, each stage of development requires the presence and the emotional attunement of a safe adult, whether it's their primary caregiver. It could be an invested adult who's safe, an aunt, an uncle, something like that. But those safe relationships are protective, and they help build resilience. And we need that in every stage of development. Without the presence and attunement of the primary caregiver, not only is there a resulting insecure attachment, but the results in that the shame becomes wired, and it becomes this underlying premise, this underlying visceral knowledge and belief that there is something wrong with me. I am not worthy of attention, love, and care. So again, the attunement with that primary caregiver, the mirror neurons where we share our emotional states, and it doesn't have to be through our eyes. That's where the mirror neurons are, though. And people who have visual ability will often share those emotional states through eye contact and things like that. But without the presence of a primary caregiver or a safe adult other, could even be an older sibling who has the ability to be consistent and safe. But generally, we're looking again at that primary caregiver. Without the presence and the attunement of that primary caregiver, the attunement is telling, and the attention is telling the child, telling me, if my parent attunes with me and spends time and connects with me, that's telling me I'm worth connecting with. And if they don't, for whatever reason, and we've gone through a lot of this discussion in the first attachment presentation, but if that doesn't happen, that is what I then grow to believe. There is something inherently wrong with me. I am not worthy of attention, of love, of care. And this can be something that drives choosing romantic partners that are abusive or neglectful, all those kinds of things, because we will end up, if we don't resolve our attachment struggles, we will end up connecting with people that reinforce that belief, that we have this internalized belief that there's something wrong with me and I'm not worthy of attention, love, and care. So we're going to go through just real quickly to talk about the different insecure attachment strategies. So with anxious attachment, shame may show itself as a need to cling to others. There might be something like a belief that, by myself, I'm nothing, or I need other people to be okay. The brain and the nervous system are wired to act out on that belief that if I can make you think that I can't take care of myself, maybe you'll stick around and take care of me. Or if I take care of you so that you need me, then you will stay around and take care of me and you won't leave me. It's the whole goal is that I do not want to be left. I don't want to be abandoned. With dismissive or avoidant attachment, Shame may present as this internal conversation, something like, I know other people are going to leave me. I know they're going to abandon me when they see who I truly am, or because of them, because of who they are. So I will stay emotionally distant from them, then I won't be hurt. And then with the disorganized attachment, the survival response to the potential or actual physical abandonment or abuse or neglect um, drives this disorganized mixture of like an anxious attachment response, a dismissive attachment response, a hostile attachment strategy. It's those things that look like they don't make sense, but they make entire sense. They completely make sense in the context of trauma. Again, all that stuff that we talked about in the earlier discussion about attachment. So rewiring then for shame resilience. Actually, before we do this, just, shame. It's hard to talk about. It's uncomfortable to feel and experience. So, just kind of recenter yourself for a minute. Just take a nice deep breath. Especially if you're by yourself, get as comfortable as you need to get. If you're not by yourself, still get comfortable. Hopefully, if you're not by yourself, you're watching this with someone that feels emotionally safe for you. But just take a nice deep breath. Just kind of give a quick reset. I'm going to take a quick drink of water here. So, since I've been talking for the whole time. Okay, so what do we do then? What do we do with the shame stuff? We're saying it's hardwired. We're saying it comes from these insecure attachment strategies. Is there any hope? There's absolutely hope. We see it all the time, and you see it all the time in these messages of hope. We see people that surmount great difficulty. We see people that work through amazingly difficult emotional challenges. We know from interpersonal neurobiology and all the technology that's become available to us in the last 20 years that our brains do rewire, that we do heal, that we can absolutely rewire and relearn so that we develop shame resilience, so that we can push back on it, so that it no longer drives us. Absolutely possible. And so here's where we're going to start. So we're going to think in terms of rewiring for shame resilience. Some people like to think of it as pushing back or challenging shame. But literally, this is what we're going to do. We're going to start this process of not being afraid of, not running away from the shame, not letting it drive us. But we're going to get curious about it, and we're going to start to deal with it, and we're going to start to address it. And you can do it. We can all do it. We'll do it together. So we know that shame is a visceral physical experience, and that our brains have developed shame wiring, as we've been talking about. Our task then is to rewire for shame resilience. And there's a lot of neurons that fire together, wire together, name it to tame it. There's a lot of kind of sayings that help us remember that our brain has grown and it has the ability to rewire. So having those phrases available to us can really help us remember, because in those moments when we're struggling with shame and words are hard to get, sometimes those little catchy phrases, sometimes we can grab onto those. You know, again, the neurons that fire together, wire together, name it to tame it, and we can take those things and move them forward. So mindfulness, I'm sure this doesn't surprise any of you. Mindfulness can help us begin that process of rewiring for shame resilience. So how do we do that? So I'm going to walk you through this, and I'm going to talk about how to talk to yourself, because we can talk about this here. You can talk about it with safe others, with friends. You can talk through it with a therapist. But the truth is, day to day, moment to moment, you're the one that you're talking to. We are always talking to ourselves about ourselves. And the better, the more aware we are of what we're saying, so that we can be the liver of our lives, and that we can manage and respond to what we're saying to ourselves. The more we do that, the more we'll be rewiring ourselves for shame resilience. So mindfulness. Mindfulness starts foundationally as noticing or observing versus interpreting or labeling. A lot of people, when they are at the very beginning of like, okay, I'll try this mindfulness stuff. The simplest and the first mindfulness practice that many people learn is what you call following your breath. And that's where you close your eyes and you get quiet and you literally, with your mind's eye, follow your breath in and follow it out, or just notice the sound of it. But you pay attention to your breath. When you bring your focus back to your breath, that is observing the breath instead of calling it breath. So instead of labeling or interpreting, we notice or observe. So in terms of rewiring for shame resilience, from this basic idea of mindfulness, of noticing and observing versus interpreting and labeling, you can ask yourself, what happens in my body when these thoughts of worthlessness come up? Notice what it's like to observe shame as a body sensation only, but with no interpretation attached. So some people experience shame kind of in that gut level area, literally like right below your solar plexus, and they feel a tightening there, and then they feel shame there. So if instead of I'm feeling shame, I'm anxious, all those kinds of things, instead of labeling that feeling, if we take a breath, you can keep your eyes open, you can close them if you want, but if you just notice the feeling, I have I have a tight feeling in my solar plexus. It's right in my stomach. It's actually not my stomach, but it feels like it's in the area of my stomach. And now that I think about it, it actually like spreads all the way kind of around my waistline. So as I just start observing and noticing the feeling, not labeling it, I'm already calming myself down. Um, but then what I'm doing is I'm getting to know my body's cues for shame, what's telling me that I'm experiencing shame. And as I notice what my body's cues are, then I can respond to them. Oh, so I have that feeling, that tight feeling in my stomach. Have I had that before? I have. I've had that. When was that? Oh, it was when this happened. How did I get through it? What happened? So for some people, just noticing, oh, it's that tight feeling in my stomach. I'm going to focus on my breathing. Those two steps right there, that will work wonders into beginning that rewiring process. So noticing, and not everybody feels it in their gut. Some people kind of feel tight in their chest. Some people feel really tight in their throat. Some people have a really muscular response, like up in their shoulders and their back. Some people have a combination. But notice what your body is doing, and notice the sensation, and even remove the label. It's not shame, it's not anxiousness, it's just, oh, this is a feeling I have. How do I describe it? So you just connect with it. And as you do that, as I said, that, as simple as that, literally helps begin that process of rewiring. So mindfulness can be really helpful. And as you can see, I've got Janina Fisher developed these shame resilience rewiring, this list. So I want to make sure that she's getting full credit for that. Um, Disidentification. So challenging the notion that shame is who I am. I am a bad person. I'm a terrible person. I just want to die. Why can't I just die? Those kinds of things. That shows identification with shame as me being this horrible person. So if we have that feeling, or you have an automatic thought like, oh, what's wrong with me? I'm just, that critical voice is just tormenting you. If you start with mindfulness, that can help too. But so that means even just taking that nice deep breath and to disidentify, to start unconnecting yourself from that notion that you are bad, that is who you are. Ask yourself, what if this idea that I'm stupid or worthless or unlovable, what if this idea isn't true? And then another way to disidentify, how did this idea help me survive? So if shame showed up in our lives in order to protect us, in order to help de-escalate a situation where things didn't feel safe, how did this thought that, whatever it would be, I'm stupid, oh, I'm just stupid, how did that thought help me survive? Well, let's see. Let's say I had a domineering parent who would argue, and then as they argued, they would escalate and get really angry, and then maybe they would be abusive. They don't even have to be abusive. It could just be that that anger is what was terrifying to me. And maybe part of what they did is punish by disconnecting from relationship. That would be scary as a little kid. So if my internalized belief from interacting with that parent, if my shame response is, oh, I'm just so stupid, if I do that, then let's say that parent comes at me and they're challenging me with something. If my automatic belief is, I'm just so stupid, what am I going to do? There's that there's that shame signal, right? So I'm going to look down, probably my head's going to bow down, my shoulders will hunch. But am I going to confront him? Am I going to disagree with her? No, no, shame protected me. That belief helped me in that moment de-escalate. And at that time, it helped me stay safe. And so doing a little bit of that kind of investigating, that curious exploration can be really helpful. And that's part of what helps us disidentify with the shame. When we see that shame served a function and now we can choose differently. So there's another tactic or another strategy for rewiring for shame resilience, and that's reframing the shame, um, attributing reframing the shame in terms of how we attach the meaning. We can attribute a different meaning. We can attribute different purpose to it. Um, so one of the ways that we can do this, we can remind and thank. So similar to this disidentification, we're like, well, how might this belief have served me? How might it have helped me survive? Our reframe can be something like, so I have that automatic, that shame thought. I might be having that physical response. And what I can do is remind myself and then thank it. So I can remind myself that shame actually helped me survive by protecting me or by dampening my emotional response or helping me de-escalate situations. It helped me stay safe. And it helped keep my responses and myself under control. That kept me safe. So I can remind myself that shame served a purpose and I don't need to fear it because it served that purpose. But guess what? I'm not 5 anymore. So I remind myself that shame served a purpose. I don't have to be afraid of it. It's not right here in this moment. It happened then. I'm experiencing it in my triggered state as it is happening right now. But I don't have to fear it. It showed up in my life in a way to help me manage, to help me cope, to help me survive. So I'll remind myself of that. And then, and it might sound kind of funny, but then I can thank the feeling for its service. And then I remind myself that that now I get to choose. So it can be that like I have that message, whatever, oh, I'm just stupid, or I'm worthless, nobody will ever love me. So I can remind myself, oh, you know what? I'm worthless and nobody will ever love me. You know what that did? That helped me stop. That helped keep me safe in my relationship with my, you know, uh, whatever my parent who was critical and punishing and or something like that. So I can say to the shame like shame, thank you for helping me when I was young, um, and thank you for the service that you protected and you helped me survive and cope. But you know what? I'm grown up now. I really appreciate you. I don't need you anymore. And it doesn't even have to be all that much. It can just be like, yeah, shame, I see what you're doing. I've got this now. Because you're talking to a younger self, you're talking to yourself, but so it can be a really simple conversation. You don't have to necessarily talk your way all the way through it. It can just be, like I said, something like, oh, I see shame. I see what you're doing. You're trying to keep me safe, but I know how to keep myself safe now. Thanks. Um, another strategy is to drop the thought, literally, like you can envision, just like boom, drop it, drop the thought. So if a shame thought comes up, nobody will ever love me. Then I can ask myself, well, what happens if I drop the thought and focus on my body? So if this thought comes into my head, nobody will ever love me, I'm going to feel something. Oh, where is it? Oh, gosh, actually, I kind of feel it in my heart, literally, like my heart hurts. Oh, wow. then, so I've dropped the content that, oh, nobody will ever love me. Oh, where's that? Oh, it's in my heart. Oh, wow, that's where it is. Gosh, when have I felt that before? But even you saw me do it as I was describing it. Then I'm going to start focusing on that physical sensation, and the power goes out of the words because now I'm getting curious and I'm exploring the sensation in my body. And so again, you can ask, oh, what happens when I drop the thought? What happens when I focus on what happens when I focus on where I feel that in my body? And even that process of asking yourself and then focusing on the physical manifestation is going to take some of the power out of the words. And then notice, this is another strategy around dropping the thought. You can say something like, nobody will ever love me. Oh, this is what it feels like when shame shows up. So I'm noticing that happen. I dropped the content that says I am unlovable and nobody will ever love me. I'm dropping that content and then I'm just noticing. So I can either notice and focus on the feeling, or I can just notice that it's happening. Oh, nobody will ever love me. Oh yeah, that's it. This is what happens when shame shows up. Oh, okay. And then like sometimes that's enough. That's like gives us enough to move on in whatever task is in front of us. So for people who have that parasympathetic hypoarousal, might really be struggling with any kind of motivation or activation, one of the things that I found to be helpful in working with people is these lists of questions that we've gone through here. Ask the questions of yourself while you are doing something, while you're walking or riding a bike or a stationary bike or moving around vigorously. The moving around, the walking, jogging, biking, moving vigorously, that kind of thing activates a different part of your brain that is not the parasympathetic energy conservation. It activates a different part of your brain, so it's going to kind of enlist that part of your brain to help you answer the questions. So if you really struggle with that low energy depression, that I just can't do anything, ask yourself these questions while you're doing something vigorous because it'll help you access different parts of your brain. And then finally, we can get curious. We can ask, does this thought have to be true? Like, so let's say that immediate thought, oh, nobody will ever love me. Does it have to be true? No, I guess it doesn't have to be true. I guess I don't have to. It doesn't like my future isn't like written in stone. I don't have to have a life where nobody ever loves me. Another curiosity question would be, are there any other explanations for this? So, oh, nobody will ever love me. Whatever, somebody didn't show up for meeting somebody for coffee and they don't show up. Oh, nobody will ever love me. Well, is there another explanation for this? Oh, well, it could be. Maybe that person, maybe they got in a car accident. Maybe they're stuck in traffic. Maybe they forgot their cell phone and they couldn't tell me they're not going to be here. So there's a whole bunch of other possible explanations. It doesn't have to be because I'm unlovable and nobody will ever love me. And then another curiosity question is, oh, what if this is just a memory? What if this is a shame memory that's coming up? So the curiosity question engages, again, a different part of our brains, and curiosity is highly correlated with resilience. So just kind of putting on that what if in a positive way, not what if like, oh, what if something bad happens, but the what if like, oh, what if this doesn't have to be true? What if there's another explanation for this? What if this is actually just a shame memory and it's not actually that I need to feel shame in this moment? Those are some of the curiosity questions. So next steps, thanks for hanging in here with me today. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning of our time together, I do encourage you to write down thoughts, feelings, reactions as much as you can right now, close to the content. Because as I said, as it pertains to shame, when shame is at work in our lives, we'll get these windows and then they close. And they open and then they close. As we continue to do the work and we grow in our awareness and mindfulness and that kind of stuff, what happens is the window stays open longer and longer, and then pretty soon it just stays open. But in the beginning, you kind of get that open shut. So writing can be a really helpful part, especially in the beginning work of dealing with shame. So write down your thoughts and feelings and reactions, any connections that you've made, any ahas. You might have ahas about yourself. You might have ahas about other people. It might be both. You might be like, oh my gosh, that interaction that I had with my friend on the phone, it was both of us. We were both like in a shame spiral. It was like a shame storm. If we'd been in the same room, there just would have been shame whipping against the walls. Maybe we were both triggered by each other, that kind of a thing. But write down those ideas because they tend to leave pretty quickly, as I said, if they're not captured. And then remember, we will have a live question and answer session in 2 weeks. So bring all those questions and thoughts to our live question and answer session so that we can continue to talk through it. We could talk about shame for weeks and weeks and years, actually. There's so much content, there's so many layers, there's so much nuance. And so this is the beginning of our conversation. So write your thoughts down, write down your questions, write down your curiosities, and then we'll talk about it when we gather together next time. So I'm going to stop presenting. And I just want to thank you again for spending some time with me today. I'm really happy to be able to have these opportunities to meet with you. I really look forward to our discussion in 2 weeks, and I hope that you will all be very, very well. We'll see you soon.